The shoe landed on my kitchen table with a soft, rubbery thud. For half a second, my mind refused to recognize it. Pink canvas, white toe cap, and a silver star Sadie had drawn near the heel because she said plain shoes looked lonely. Grant stood across from me, with one hand braced on a chair. He had come to discuss Thursday's custody modification hearing. At least, that was what he had said. Inside the box, beneath the shoe, lay a folded sheet of paper. "She's alive. Call the police, and you'll never see her again." My knees weakened. Ranger lifted his gray muzzle from beside the refrigerator and stared at Grant. Not at the box. At Grant. "Don't," Grant said as my hand moved toward my phone. His voice was low and controlled, the same voice he used in court when he wanted everyone else to look unreasonable. "Think before you make this worse. Our daughter is missing. And you didn't even know she had left school." His eyes flicked toward the box, then back to me. "This is exactly why the judge should never trust you." Something inside me cracked, but it did not break the way he expected. I called 911. Grant cursed, grabbed his rain jacket, and headed for the door. "I'm going to find her before your panic gets her killed." Ranger rose stiffly, his back legs trembling once. Grant opened the rear hatch of his SUV to throw in a flashlight and a coil of rope while rain tapped against the driveway. Ranger crossed the porch, pressed his nose to Grant's sleeve, then to the open cargo space. Grant shoved him away. "Go lie down, old man." The dispatcher was asking me to repeat the message when Grant drove off. I turned toward Ranger's bed. It was empty. "Before I tell you where that old dog was going, tell me where you're listening from. Stay with me through what happened next, and subscribe to the channel if you believe a child should never be used as a weapon between two parents." 25 minutes earlier, I still believed the worst thing waiting for me that week was a courtroom. It was Monday, the 14th of September 2026, 4 days before Grant's request for primary custody was scheduled to be heard. I had spent the afternoon straightening things that were already straight and checking the clock every few minutes. Sadie's bus usually turned onto our street just before 3. Ranger knew the schedule better than I did. Even at 10 years old, with an old shoulder injury and arthritis in his back legs, he would push himself up before I heard the engine. That afternoon, he lay beneath the front window, with his chin beside the book Sadie had been reading to him. The bowl near the pantry already held his joint pill inside a spoonful of wet food. Sadie had prepared it before school and left me a note not to forget. Ranger had spent years following human scent for the county search team before he retired. After he came to live with us, Sadie stopped treating him like a working dog within a week. To her, he was the one creature who never asked which parent she preferred or expected her to say she was fine. Grant arrived at 2:50, 10 minutes before the bus, carrying a folder he never opened. He said we needed to agree on what we would tell the judge. What he meant was that I needed to agree with him. "Sadie is anxious because you keep making the hearing sound frightening," he said, settling into the chair across from me as though the kitchen still belonged to him. "She needs one stable home, Mara. Not 2 houses, and a mother who asks how she feels every hour. I ask because she has started waking up at night. And then you tell everyone my custody request caused it." His mouth tightened into the patient expression he had perfected during our divorce. "You turn normal childhood stress into evidence against me." I kept both hands around my coffee mug. During our marriage, Grant learned that if he stayed quiet, I would explain myself until I sounded defensive. Then he would repeat my most emotional sentence later, as proof that I could not control myself. I had promised my attorney I would not give him another one. The bus passed our driveway without slowing. Ranger raised his head but did not stand. I watched the yellow shape continue down the road, waiting for brake lights that never appeared. By the time I reached for my phone, Grant was already watching my face. The school secretary checked the transportation list, then went quiet. Sadie was signed out at 1:45. "By whom?" "Diane Ellison. She is still listed as an approved pickup person. She said you had agreed to an appointment." Diane was Grant's mother. Her name remained on the list because there was no order preventing her from picking Sadie up, and until that moment I had never believed I needed one. I agreed to nothing, I said. Grant leaned forward. His surprise arrived a fraction too late, then settled into place. My mother took her? The secretary said the school would preserve the sign-out record. I called Diane, but the call went straight to voicemail. Maybe she misunderstood something, Grant said. An appointment with whom? I don't know. Let me call her. He turned away before dialing, shielding the screen with his body. That movement bothered me, but fear was already crowding out every quieter instinct. I called Sadie's phone and heard her cheerful recorded voice. Grant called twice, then announced that Diane was not answering him either. The doorbell rang. A local courier stood under the porch awning with rain darkening his shoulders. He handed me a plain cardboard box and asked me to confirm my name. There was no return address. Grant asked whether I was expecting anything. I shook my head and carried the box to the kitchen. Ranger stood this time. He did not approach the package. Instead, he moved close to Grant and drew one long breath along the cuff of his jacket. "Control your dog," Grant said. The tape had been cut once and pressed back down. I lifted the flap. The pink shoe lay inside, with its silver star facing upward. For one terrible second, I saw Sadie at breakfast that morning, swinging that same shoe beneath her chair while she hid Ranger's pill in his food. Then I unfolded the note and reached the moment I told you about at the beginning. Grant urged me to wait 20 minutes. He said whoever sent the box might be watching and could hurt Sadie. The second police arrived. Part of me wanted to obey because a mother will bargain with anything when someone says her child is alive. Then I looked at the shoe. Someone had removed it from my daughter, knew where I lived, and had arranged a delivery for the exact hour Grant was in my kitchen. Silence would not make Sadie safer. It would only leave me alone, with rules written by whoever had taken her. I placed the note back without touching anything else, and called 911. Grant did what he always did when I refused his version of events. He made my decision sound like panic, my fear sound like incompetence, and my missing child sound like evidence for his custody case. As he crossed the driveway, Ranger followed. The old dog pressed his nose to Grant's sleeve, then his trouser leg. When Grant opened the rear hatch, I saw the edge of Sadie's blue hoodie beneath a blanket. Before I could ask why it was there, the dispatcher asked for my address again. Grant threw in a flashlight and rope, shoved Ranger away, and climbed behind the wheel. Rain ticked across the SUV as it disappeared toward the west. Only then did I notice Ranger had not returned to the porch. I opened his GPS app with shaking fingers. A new location appeared on the western highway, moving too fast for any dog on foot. I watched it travel for several seconds before the signal froze where the road entered the mountains. Ranger had not wandered away. He was inside Grant's car, and Grant was taking him somewhere the signal could no longer follow. The blue dot stopped moving where the western highway narrowed between the mountains. I refreshed the screen twice, then a third time, as if fear could force the signal to return. Ranger's caller had traveled nearly 12 miles at the speed of a car. Now the app showed only the last location and the words, "Connection unavailable." Red and blue lights washed across my kitchen windows. Detective Lorna Price entered without wasting time on reassurance she could not honestly give. She was in her 50s, with rain silvering the shoulders of her dark jacket, and a voice that stayed steady, even when mine did not. She photographed the box where it sat, placed the note and Sadie's shoe into separate evidence bags, and asked another officer to contact the school. The school was told to preserve the pickup record, hallway video, and parking lot footage. Every question returned to the same fact. Diane had signed my daughter out, and neither Grant nor I could reach her. I showed Lorna the GPS app. Ranger was in Grant's SUV. I saw him follow Grant to the hatch, and now his caller is moving west. Could he have jumped out somewhere? Not at that speed. She studied the route, then took screenshots showing the time and location. The signal ends where coverage gets unreliable, This gives us a direction, not a destination. My phone rang before I could answer. Grant's name appeared on the screen. Lorna nodded for me to put him on speaker. I checked the streets around the school, Grant said over the noise of his engine. No one has seen her. Ranger is in your car. There was a pause, brief enough that another person might have missed it. What are you talking about? His caller traveled west with you. That dog jumped into the back while I was loading things. He could have gotten out when I stopped. Where did you stop? I'm trying to find our daughter, Mara. I'm not keeping a travel diary for you. Lorna leaned closer. Mr. Ellison, this is Detective Price. We need you to pull over and give us your current location. I'm checking places Sadie might know. If I turn around every time Mara decides something feels suspicious, we lose time. The call ended before Lorna could answer. She did not curse or make a dramatic declaration. She simply wrote down his words and sent his number and vehicle description to the officers coordinating the search. At that moment, I still believed Grant might be hiding something connected to Diane. I did not yet understand that he had planned the missing child, the shoe on my table, and even the version of Sadie he wanted the police to find. What I did not know then, and what Sadie told me only after we brought her home, was that Diane had collected her from school with a smile and a lie. Diane said they were going to a private appointment connected to the custody hearing. She told Sadie that adults sometimes needed to speak with children away from both parents so no one could influence their answers. Because Diane had picked her up before for dentist visits and family dinners, Sadie followed her without making a scene. The drive took them west. Sadie counted turns because she had been doing it since kindergarten whenever she wanted to prove she knew the way home. She remembered 6 right turns, 4 left turns, and the sound of a railroad crossing bell before they entered the mountains. Rain had not started yet, but the sky had turned the color of wet concrete. Near the end of a narrow road, they passed a leaning wooden sign that read, Blackridge Pines. We later found the same sign in photographs from the old summer camp where Grant had once run youth programs. Diane drove past empty cabins and stopped beside a low-maintenance building near a creek. Grant's SUV was already there. Sadie told me that was the first moment she understood the appointment was not what her grandmother had described. Grant came out carrying a grocery bag and Sadie's blue hoodie. He told Diane the evaluator did not want relatives crowding the conversation. Diane hesitated, but Grant kissed her cheek and said he had everything handled. She left without asking why no professional had arrived, or why the camp had been closed for years. Grant took Sadie into the maintenance cabin. He had placed a folded blanket on a cot, bottled water on a shelf, a flashlight, crackers, and an apple inside a paper bag. Those details mattered to him later. He pointed to each item as proof that he had never intended to hurt her. To Sadie, they made the room feel prepared. Grant told her they were going to help the judge see the truth. What truth? She asked. That your mother panics, that she doesn't listen to what you need. Sadie said she had not told him that. You don't have to say it exactly that way, he replied. You only have to tell them you left school because you were afraid she would be angry. But I didn't leave. Grandma picked me up. Grant crouched in front of her. He used the soft voice he reserved for promises and warnings. This is a test, sweetheart. I'm going to come back with people looking for you. When I open the door, you run to me. You tell them you came here because you were scared to go home. Sadie asked whether I knew about the test. Your mother will understand afterward. What if I say it wrong? His hand tightened around her shoulder. Then the judge might decide I shouldn't see you anymore. That was how he trapped her. He did not threaten to hurt her. He made her believe one imperfect sentence could erase her father from her life. Sadie noticed her left shoe was missing when she looked down. Grant had removed it in the car while telling her there was mud on the sole. When she asked for it back, he said he needed it for the test. He took her phone, claiming the evaluator did not allow distractions. Then he told her to stay inside, not to look through the windows and not to open the door for anyone except him. He fastened the main latch from the outside. For a while, Sadie sat on the cot and tried to practice the sentence. She could repeat the words, but she could not make them sound true. She drank a little water, listened to the creak, and told herself that responsible adults did strange things for court hearings. Then she heard Grant's SUV return. The rear hatch opened. Something heavy shifted inside, followed by the scrape of claws on metal. Ranger jumped down. He moved stiffly after the long ride, but the second he saw Sadie through the open door, his entire body changed. His ears lifted. He pulled past Grant and went straight to her. Sadie dropped to her knees and wrapped both arms around his neck. She buried her face in his damp fur and began to cry. Until then, she had been trying to prove she could handle the test. Grant stared at Ranger, as if the old dog had personally insulted him. Then he noticed the black GPS collar beneath the fur. He checked his phone, looked toward the surrounding mountains, and relaxed. The cabin sat in a hollow where service came and went. He believed the collar could not send a useful location from there. "You weren't supposed to be part of this," he muttered. Sadie asked whether Ranger could stay. Grant looked from the dog to the empty road. I can only know what he decided, from what he told Sadie next, and from how his plan unfolded afterward. Instead of taking Ranger away, he saw another way to make himself look heroic. "Yes," he said. "He can stay with you." He pointed toward the door, as if Ranger could understand every part of the performance. "When I come back with the search team, he'll make it look like he led me here. People trust dogs." Rain began ticking against the roof. Grant checked his phone. A flood watch had been issued for the mountain counties, but it was still only a warning that conditions might develop. He had planned to return long before the creek became dangerous. He left the water, the blanket, and Ranger beside Sadie. Then he repeated that she must not open the door for anyone but him. Before closing it, Grant looked down at the old dog and smiled. "When I come back, you lead them straight to me." He fastened the latch and walked into the rain. As he crossed toward his SUV, his phone vibrated with the first weather alert. The first useful signal from Ranger's collar appeared 7 minutes after Grant's weather alert would later show on his phone records. At the time, all I saw was a blue point flashing onto the western edge of the map. It appeared near an old county road, stayed long enough for the app to register its location, then vanished again. "Blackridge Pines," I said. Detective Price leaned over my shoulder. The application had stored part of Ranger's route before losing service. It showed Grant's SUV traveling west, not north toward the school as he had claimed. Lorna enlarged the map. "Do you recognize the area?" Grant used to run summer sports programs there. Soccer camps, climbing weekends, things like that. The camp had closed several years earlier after the county stopped renewing its operating contract. I had visited once during a family activity day. I remembered wooden cabins, a dining hall, and a creek that ran along the lower field. I did not remember enough to identify where Ranger might be inside the property. Lorna called for a patrol unit to check the entrance road. Her instructions took less than a minute. The road was already slick. Visibility was worsening, and the officer approaching from the nearest town warned that water was gathering in the low places. "This gives us a direction," Lorna said. "It still does not prove Grant took Sadie there. He lied about where he was. It proves he lied about his route." The distinction frustrated me, but I understood why she made it. I had spent years telling Grant that something felt wrong, only to have him demand evidence I did not yet possess. This time, I would not give him the chance to dismiss everything because I had reached the right conclusion too quickly. I wrote the time of the GPS update on the back of an unopened envelope. Then I wrote Grant's exact words from our call, checking the streets around the school. "No one has seen her." My phone rang again. Grant did not wait for me to speak. "Have the police found anything?" Lorna motioned for me to use the speaker. "Ranger's caller sent a location near Blackridge Pines," I said. "You told me you were north of the school." "I drove past the camp because kids used to hide there when I ran programs." "You did not say that before." "I did not think I needed to list every road I checked." "Where is Ranger?" He must have jumped out when I slowed down. I told you he got into the car without me noticing. Grant's explanation came too smoothly. He had not asked whether the signal showed Ranger moving or standing still. He had not asked whether someone had seen Sadie. His first concern was explaining why the dog's collar contradicted him. Lorna spoke before I could respond. Mr. Ellison, remain where you are and send your current location. I'm already heading back toward the school. Mara is turning this into another investigation of me. Our daughter disappeared while your mother was the last known adult with her, I said. Your car went to a place you know, and Ranger went with you. There it is, Grant replied. You would rather accuse me than focus on finding Sadie. This obsession is exactly what I have been trying to explain to the judge. The words struck the place he intended, but I did not defend myself. I wrote them down. I'm obsessed with finding my daughter, I said. Tell Detective Price where you are. Grant ended the call. Lorna looked at what I had written. Good, keep doing that. Times, words, and actions. Not guesses. I nodded, though every part of me wanted to run toward Blackridge Pines myself. Staying in that kitchen felt like abandoning Sadie, but rushing into the mountains without knowing where she was would only turn me into another person who needed rescuing. Grant had counted on my fear, driving me into a mistake. I refused to let him direct me from a distance. I looked toward the empty place beside the refrigerator and remembered Ranger's behavior before he entered Grant's SUV. He had barely sniffed the package. His attention had stayed on Grant's sleeve, his trouser leg, and the open cargo area. He smelled her, I said. Lorna glanced up. Explain. Ranger did not react to the shoe. He reacted to Grant. There was a blue hoodie in the back of the SUV. It looked like Sadie's. Could the hoodie have been left there during a custody visit? Sadie came home from Grant's house yesterday wearing it. She put it over the chair beside Ranger before bed. It was in this house this morning. The memory made my stomach tighten. I could see Sadie tugging the sleeves over her hands while she ate breakfast. I had watched her leave for school with the hoodie tied around her waist. Could Grant have seen Sadie today for any legitimate reason? Lorna asked. No. I made myself answer, without adding what I suspected. I did not say he had taken her. I did not say the shoe, the hoodie, and Ranger's reaction proved everything. I gave Lorna only what I knew. He was not scheduled to see her. The school did not call him. I did not give him permission to pick her up. Lorna relayed the hoodie description to the officers. Then she asked the school to check whether Sadie had been wearing it when Diane signed her out. According to what Sadie told me later, Ranger was still panting heavily inside the cabin while I sat at my kitchen table trying to turn instinct into evidence. She poured some water into the lid of one of the bottles and placed it on the floor. Ranger drank, paused to breathe, then drank again. The trip had stiffened his shoulder. When he lowered himself beside the cot, his back legs folded slowly beneath him. Sadie sat on the floor rather than the blanket Grant had prepared. She kept one hand on Ranger's neck and listened to the rain strike the roof. Dad said it's a test, she whispered. But tests are supposed to have teachers. Ranger rested his head across her shin. Sadie later told me that she wished he could answer. She did not expect him to understand the custody hearing or explain why her father had taken her shoe. She only wanted one living thing in that room to behave as though her fear made sense. She tried repeating the sentence Grant had taught her. I left school because I was afraid Mom would be angry. The words sounded wrong, even when no one else was there to hear them. Sadie knew I sometimes raised my voice when I was frightened. She knew Grant hated when I asked too many questions. But she also knew she had not left school. Her grandmother had signed her out, and her father had brought her to a locked cabin. A thin line of water appeared beneath the door. Sadie watched it creep across the floorboards and remembered something I had taught her during a summer storm. Never step into moving water when you cannot see the ground. Even shallow water could knock a person down, and a road covered by water might not have a road beneath it anymore. She also remembered a survival story she had read to Ranger. The child in the book had left a backpack behind because reaching higher ground mattered more than saving supplies. Still, she stayed where she was. Grant had told her to wait. He had said the judge might stop him from seeing her if she did the test incorrectly. Sadie was 10 years old. She could recognize that something was wrong and still believe it was her responsibility to keep it from becoming worse. Grant's phone records later showed that a flash flood warning reached him while he was driving back toward the volunteer search point near the school. The warning named low-lying roads, small creeks, and the western mountain communities surrounding Blackridge Pines. He slowed for several seconds. He could have called Lorna. He could have said Sadie might be at the camp. He could have sent rescuers toward the cabin before the water rose. Instead, he called me. "Any news?" he asked when I answered. In the background, I heard windshield wipers moving at their highest speed. "No," I said. "But you already knew that." He told me I was wasting time accusing him. Then he said he would speak to the officers when he arrived. Inside the cabin, the line of water widened. It reached Sadie's remaining shoe and touched the white rubber toe. Ranger lifted his head. Despite the pain in his back legs, he pushed himself upright and turned toward a low-maintenance door at the far end of the cabin. By the time Grant reached the school, the parking lot had become a search staging area. Police cruisers lined the curb. Teachers stood beneath umbrellas, while volunteers gathered around folding tables covered with maps. Rainwater ran across the painted lines and collected around their shoes. Detective Price drove me there because she did not want me following the GPS route alone. Grant arrived wearing the rain jacket he had taken from my house. He moved through the crowd like a man who belonged at the center of it, shaking hands, answering questions, and thanking people for coming. Anyone watching him would have seen a frightened father forcing himself to stay useful. I saw a man choosing his audience. "Sadie knows the neighborhood around the school," he told a deputy. "Check the walking trail behind the baseball field and the drainage path near the library." He pointed to routes close enough to make sense and far enough from Blackridge Pines to waste time. Then he lowered his voice, though not enough to prevent the volunteers around him from hearing. "She has been upset lately. Mara and I have a custody hearing this week." The deputy glanced toward me. Grant continued before anyone asked what that had to do with Sadie's disappearance. "She may have felt trapped between us. She's been afraid of disappointing her mother." I wanted to cross the parking lot and tell everyone he was lying. I wanted to ask why Ranger had followed his SUV west and why Sadie's hoodie had been in the back. Grant expected that reaction. He wanted witnesses to see him speaking calmly, while I shouted accusations. Instead, I turned to Lorna. "The GPS signal was near Blackridge Pines," I said quietly. "Grant worked there. Can you check whether he still has access to the property?" I already requested the ownership and access records. "There may be old program files through the recreation department." She nodded and added the request to the notes on her phone. I gave her the screenshots, the time of Grant's calls, and the description of Sadie's hoodie. Then I stepped back. Grant looked disappointed when I did not confront him. At that moment, I did not know how quickly the water was rising around Sadie. What I know about the cabin came later, from what she told me in the hospital and from the marks rescuers found on the walls and floor. The thin stream beneath the door spread until the boards around Sadie's remaining shoe disappeared under dark water. Ranger crossed the room and scratched at the low-maintenance door. His nails dragged over the wood in short, urgent strokes. Sadie followed him, but stopped before touching the latch. "My dad said to wait," she told him. Ranger scratched again, then looked back at her. The rain no longer sounded like drops striking a roof. It had become a continuous roar. Something heavy rolled or slid outside and struck the cabin wall hard enough to shake the flashlight from the shelf. It hit the floor, flickered, and came back on with a weak yellow glow. The water smelled like mud, wet leaves, and something metallic. It climbed over the white rubber edge of Sadie's shoe. She knew the room was becoming dangerous. She also believed leaving might destroy her father's life. Grant had told her the judge could stop him from seeing her if she failed the test. He had made obedience feel like the only way to keep both parents. Sadie put one hand on Ranger's shoulder. He said this was how I helped. Ranger did not understand Grant's plan. He only knew the room was filling with water. He returned to the maintenance door and pressed his nose along the bottom seam. Outside the school, Grant had gathered a small circle around himself. He repeated the same version of Sadie until it began to sound like a fact. She was sensitive. She had been under pressure. She might have run away because she feared my reaction. Each time someone offered another theory, Grant brought the conversation back to me. She worries about upsetting Mara. Mara asks too many questions when Sadie is anxious. I've been warning people that the pressure at home is getting worse. He was not searching for our daughter. He was preparing witnesses for the story he had ordered her to tell. A deputy approached with rain running from the brim of his hat. The unit heading toward Blackridge Pines says water is crossing the access road. They may need to wait for a higher clearance vehicle. Grant's face changed for less than a second. Lorna saw it too. You worked at that camp? The deputy asked. Years ago, Grant said. I haven't been back since the program's closed. Do you know of any structures where a child might shelter? Grant looked toward the road, where another cruiser was pulling in. His phone was still in his hand. The flash flood warning had already reached it. He knew the creek ran beside the cabin. He knew Sadie was locked inside with one shoe, a bottle of water, and an old dog. He could have named the place. Instead, he said, Ranger probably jumped out near the property and chased a deer. That collar signal may have nothing to do with Sadie. The deputy frowned. In this rain? He was trained to follow scent. He gets confused now that he's old. Grant had spent years mocking Ranger because the dog moved slowly and needed medication. Now he was using that weakness to dismiss the only witness he had failed to control. Lorna stepped closer. You said you have not been there in years. I haven't. Then why did you drive through the property today? I checked the road, that's all. And if Ranger got out there, why didn't you report it? Grant's jaw tightened. Because my daughter is missing. I was not going to stop searching to discuss a dog. A radio on the folding table crackled. The officer near Blackridge Pines reported that the creek had risen over part of the lower road. Grant looked at the map and spoke before anyone asked him another question. If Sadie somehow reached the maintenance cabin, the search team needs to move quickly. The words seemed to silence the rain around us. Lorna turned toward him. What maintenance cabin? Grant's eyes moved from her to the map. You said the camp, he replied. Every camp has a maintenance building. You named one specific structure. I remember it from when I worked there. You just said you only checked the road today. I did. Then how do you know Ranger's signal was close to that cabin? Grant looked at me, as if I had placed the words in his mouth. This is what Mara does, he said. She takes normal information and makes it sound criminal. I did not answer. For the first time, I did not need him to admit anything. The lie had begun to pull against itself. Ranger's route, the hoodie, Grant's history at the camp and the name of the cabin were pointing in the same direction. Lorna ordered the team approaching Blackridge Pines to prioritize the maintenance area as soon as the road could be crossed safely. Grant protested that they were wasting resources on my suspicions, but no one was listening to him in quite the same way anymore. Inside the cabin, the water had reached Sadie's ankles. The flashlight dimmed again. A sharp crack sounded above her, and a section of ceiling board fell onto the cot where she had been sitting minutes earlier. Dust and rainwater sprayed across the blanket Grant had left for her. Ranger moved between Sadie and the fallen board. He caught her sleeve gently between his teeth and pulled once, then released it and returned to the maintenance door. Sadie looked at the water, the broken ceiling and the door her father had forbidden her to open. Then she stopped waiting for him. The maintenance panel had not been designed as an exit, but its latch was on the inside. Sadie pushed aside a hanging mop, found the metal hook and lifted it with both hands. The swollen wood resisted. Ranger pressed his nose into the widening gap, while Sadie pulled until the latch scraped free. Cold rain blew into the cabin. Sadie lowered herself to her knees and crawled through first. Ranger followed slowly, his injured shoulder catching against the narrow frame until she reached back and guided him. They had barely cleared the wall when a deep rumble rolled down from the hillside. Sadie turned toward the sound. Behind her and Ranger, the ground began to move. Everything that happened after Sadie crawled through the maintenance door came to me later in pieces. Some of it she told me from a hospital bed. Some of it rescuers reconstructed from footprints, broken branches, and Ranger's stored route. I have never pretended I was beside her on that hillside, but I have carried every detail she could remember. The rumble above the cabin grew, until Sadie felt it through her palms. Ranger turned away from the building and pulled toward the gravel road. The lower half of the road had disappeared beneath fast brown water. Branches spun through it, striking the fence posts before vanishing around the bend. Sadie remembered what I had taught her during storms. Water did not have to look deep to be dangerous. If it was moving too quickly to see the ground, she was not to step into it. Ranger lowered his nose near the edge, backed away and turned toward a narrow trail rising behind the cabin. At the time, Sadie thought he had simply chosen the only direction without water. I learned later that the path was an old maintenance route Ranger had crossed during a search and rescue exercise years earlier. He was not predicting the flood or understanding a map. His body remembered a road his mind could no longer name. Sadie followed him into the trees. Rain struck her face so hard she had to look down. The single shoe on her right foot slid against the mud, while her left sock collected grit and pine needles. She moved carefully because Ranger could not climb quickly. Every few steps, he stopped, checked behind him, and waited until she reached his side. Near the first bend, Sadie pulled the elastic band from her wet hair. She tied it around a low branch beside the trail. It was bright purple, the color I had bought because she kept losing the plain ones. She did not believe a hair tie would bring anyone to her. She only wanted to leave proof that she had not gone toward the flooded road. Ranger climbed another few yards before his back legs slipped. His body twisted, and his injured shoulder struck the ground. He made a sound Sadie had never heard from him before, low and sharp, then tried to stand as though nothing had happened. "Slow," she told him. It was one of the old commands I had taught her. Ranger stopped struggling and looked at her. Sadie crouched beside him, mud covered the gray fur around his muzzle. His breathing came in short bursts, and one back leg trembled each time he tried to put weight on it. Until that moment, she had believed Ranger would lead her out because that was what he had always done. He waited by the bus, slept beside her after bad dreams, and followed when she wandered too far into the yard. On the hillside, she understood that he could not carry both of them. Her school backpack was still strapped over one shoulder. Grant had left it with her because there was nothing inside that could call for help. Sadie emptied the books onto the ground, pulled one strap loose and slid it beneath Ranger's chest. She held the ends like a harness while he pushed himself upright. They moved together. Ranger chose the direction, but Sadie took part of his weight each time the path steepened. A crack of thunder exploded over the trees. Sadie dropped the strap and covered her ears. She told me she began crying then, not quietly and not bravely. The sound was close enough to make her teeth hurt, and for several seconds she could not make herself move. She looked down through the trees toward the cabin. Part of her wanted to return. Grant would go there when he came back with the police. He had told her to wait inside. If she was not there, everyone might search the wrong place, and he might say she had ruined the test. "I think Dad will come back," she told Ranger. The dog had turned across the trail. His body blocked the way downhill. Sadie tried to step around him. Ranger shifted with her, not growling or pushing, simply refusing to follow her back toward the water. Another object struck the cabin below. This time, the sound was followed by breaking wood. Sadie stared through the rain and finally understood that obeying Grant would not make the building safe. A judge, a test, and the words she had practiced no longer mattered. Her father had promised to return before anything happened, but the storm did not know about his promise. She picked up the makeshift harness. "Forward," she said. Ranger turned uphill. It was another command from his working years. Sadie had used it in our yard when she wanted him to walk ahead instead of stopping to watch her. He obeyed now, though each step cost him more than the last. She talked while they climbed. She told him about the unfinished chapter in the book beside his bed. She reminded him that the explorer had not reached the island yet, and that he was not allowed to miss the ending. Ranger could not understand the story, but Sadie said speaking gave her something to follow besides the thunder. One sentence led to the next, just as one tree led to another. She kept her voice steady for him, and discovered it steadied her too. The trail narrowed beside a stone ledge. Ranger placed his front paws on the first rise, but could not lift his back legs high enough. He tried once, slipped and struck his shoulder again. Sadie climbed onto the ledge, wrapped the backpack strap beneath his chest and leaned backward with both hands. She was not strong enough to lift him. Instead, she held his weight while he pushed. "Up," she said through her tears. "Come on, Ranger. Up." His front claws scraped across the stone. For one frightening second, his body slid toward her. Then one back foot found the edge. Sadie pulled, Ranger pushed, and they collapsed together on the higher side. They had barely moved away when the hillside below them let go. Sadie described the sound as a train passing beneath the ground. Mud, water, and broken limbs swept through the trees, gathering speed as they descended. A large tree tipped, its roots lifting a wall of earth into the rain. The flow struck the lower side of the cabin. The roof shifted. One wall folded inward, and the maintenance door through which Sadie and Ranger had escaped vanished beneath branches and brown water. The blanket, the cot, and the room where Grant had ordered her to wait disappeared behind mud. Sadie stopped crying because she could no longer breathe deeply enough to do it. She watched the place her father had called safe break apart in seconds. That was when she stopped believing he had everything under control. Ranger struggled back to his feet and moved farther along the ridge. The trail curved away from the destroyed cabin and entered thicker trees. Sadie followed, keeping the strap under his chest. Her bare sock had torn at the heel, and every stone cut through the wet fabric, but she did not remove it. She was afraid that if she stopped too long, Ranger would lie down and refuse to rise again. The air changed near the top of the slope. Ranger lifted his nose and turned toward a patch of brush. Behind it stood a low concrete building with a rusted metal roof. The old pump house sat above the main camp, partly hidden by vines but clear of the water below. Ranger pushed through the brush. Sadie found the door swollen but not locked. She leaned against it until it opened far enough for her to squeeze inside. Ranger reached the threshold and collapsed. Sadie crawled back into the rain, looped both backpack straps beneath his chest and pulled. His paws scraped over the concrete lip. She braced one foot against the doorframe and dragged until his shoulders crossed the threshold. Ranger tried once to help, then let his body go heavy. Sadie pulled him the rest of the way inside. When she turned toward the doorway, the hillside below was no longer a path through trees. It had become a moving field of mud and water. The cabin was almost impossible to see. High on the ridge, Ranger's collar caught a weak cellular signal. It began uploading part of the route it had stored since leaving the cabin. Sadie knew nothing about the signal. She sat on the concrete floor beside Ranger, placed both hands against his wet fur, and listened to the storm close around them. Far below, I was still staring at an incomplete map. The map on my phone showed only broken pieces of Ranger's route. One point near the camp entrance, another farther uphill, then nothing. The collar had stored more than it could transmit from inside the mountain hollow, but I did not know how much of the route was still waiting to upload. A rescue truck finally reached the first flooded crossing at Blackridge Pines. The radio report came through the folding table command post in clipped fragments. The lower road was covered. Mud had fallen across one lane. The crew was searching for another way in. Grant stood close enough to hear every word. I crossed the parking lot and stopped in front of him. Rain ran from his hair onto the collar of his jacket. He looked tired now, but not lost. There was a difference, and I could finally see it. What is at that camp? His eyes narrowed. You're still doing this? I asked one question. Our daughter is missing, and you need someone to blame so you don't have to face what happened under your watch. He raised his voice just enough for the officers nearby to hear. He wanted me to defend myself, list everything I had done for Sadie, and prove that he could still pull me away from the only question that mattered. I kept my voice level. What is at that camp? Grant looked toward Detective Price. This is the instability I've been telling everyone about. She decides on a story, then forces every fact into it. Lorna stepped beside me. Your mother signed Sadie out of school. Ranger traveled in your vehicle. His collar pinged near a property you once had access to. You told us you were searching north of the school, but your route went west. I have explained all of that. You explained each piece separately, Lorna said. You have not explained why they all happened in the same afternoon. Grant opened his mouth, but Lorna's phone rang before he answered. She checked the screen and placed the call on speaker. Diane's voice came through thin and frightened. She had finally returned the messages after seeing police cars outside Grant's house. Mrs. Ellison, Lorna said. Did you pick Sadie up from school today? Yes. Did Mara authorize it? Diane hesitated. Grant said she had. My fingers curled around the edge of the table. Diane continued quickly. He told me Sadie had a private preparation session for the custody hearing. He said neither parent was supposed to take her because the specialist wanted her answers to be independent. Where did you take her? Another pause followed. This one lasted long enough for Grant to turn away. Blackridge Pines, Diane said. Grant was waiting there. The people nearest us stopped moving. Lorna asked whether Diane had seen a counselor, custody evaluator, or any other professional. No. Grant said the woman was running late. He told me to leave before she arrived. You left Sadie alone with him? He is her father. Diane began to cry, but Lorna did not allow the call to become a confession of regret. She confirmed the arrival time, the vehicle Diane had seen, and the building near which Grant had been waiting. Then she ended the call. Grant no longer had an explanation for how Sadie reached the camp. She may have left after my mother dropped her off, he said. That property covers hundreds of acres. You were there, I said. I was trying to talk to her before the hearing. I did not kidnap my own child. Lorna asked which building Diane had used. Grant shook his head. I met them near the central field. Sadie ran off after my mother left. It was the first time he had claimed Sadie ran away from him, and he said it without surprise, as if the story had been waiting in his pocket. What direction? Lorna asked. I don't know. Into the trees. Why didn't you call anyone? I thought I could find her. The radio crackled again. The main entrance was still blocked, but an older service road curved around the southern ridge. Grant looked toward his SUV. I know that road. I can get there faster than your trucks. He started walking before anyone gave permission. Lorna sent a deputy after him and ordered that Grant not be allowed out of sight. He was no longer treated like a helpful parent. He was a man connected to the last confirmed location of a missing child. 10 minutes later, the deputy reported that the southern road had been cut by a fresh slide. Grant had tried to continue on foot until the deputy stopped him. He kept insisting that every minute mattered while refusing to name the place where those minutes mattered most. According to what Sadie later told me, she was trying to save Ranger's foot while we stood below, arguing with the man who had put them there. Inside the pump house, she found a narrow concrete shelf high enough to stay dry. Ranger could not climb onto it, so she sat on the floor and pulled his body against her legs. Blood mixed with the rainwater around one of his front paws. Sadie removed the sock from her bare left foot and wrapped it around the cut. Her fingers were cold and clumsy, but she tied the fabric tightly enough to hold. Ranger pressed his side against her. His fur was soaked, yet the weight of his body gave her more warmth than the concrete walls did. The building contained no working radio, emergency supplies, or convenient way to call for help. There was a rusted metal pipe running along one wall, a vent near the roof, and an empty shelf coated in dust. Sadie climbed onto the shelf only long enough to look through the vent. She could see rain, trees, and a gray slope disappearing into mist. She returned to Ranger and listened to the storm. Grant's words kept returning to her. "When I come back with everyone, run to me." At first, she had believed he meant people would help complete the test. In the pump house, she understood why he needed them there. He wanted them to see him open the door. He wanted them to see her run into his arms. He wanted her to say the words he had taught her, while everyone watched him become the person who saved her. Sadie did not tell me she decided her father was evil. Children rarely change their love that cleanly. She said only that she realized he had cared more about what people would see than about how frightened she was. She laid her hand over Ranger's ribs and counted each breath. At the command post, a rescuer finally reported that a crew had reached the maintenance cabin from the upper side. Part of the roof had collapsed, and mud covered the lower wall. They had found one of Sadie's school papers trapped beside the low-maintenance door. My knees nearly gave way. Lorna caught my arm before I struck the table. The rescuer continued. The main room was damaged, and they could not yet search beneath every section of debris. There was no visible sign of Sadie or Ranger. Grant stepped toward the radio. "Check beneath the cot against the wall." Lorna turned slowly. "How do you know there is a cot?" Grant's face emptied. "I remember the cabin from years ago." "You remembered the cot, but you did not remember to tell us your daughter was there?" "I never said she was there." The radio went silent for several seconds. Then the rescuer's voice returned. "We've reached the accessible section. There's nobody inside." The people around me seemed to stop breathing. Everyone was looking toward the buried cabin on the map, imagining Sadie and Ranger beneath mud that no one could safely move yet. I forced myself to look at the GPS route again. The last blue point was not at the cabin. I enlarged the map until the screen blurred beneath the rain on my fingers. Ranger's caller had recorded his route while it had no signal, then uploaded part of that stored path when he reached higher ground. The new line began near the maintenance cabin, crossed behind it, and continued uphill. It was not the clean, fast movement I had watched while Ranger was inside Grant's SUV. This route crawled. It stopped repeatedly, shifted sideways, and continued again. "They walked," I said. Detective Price moved beside me. "What do you see?" Ranger stopped at the cabin, but he didn't stay there. "Look at the timestamps. It took almost 30 minutes to travel 200 yards. The search coordinator studied the screen. Mud streaked his gloves and water ran from his helmet. The caller could have drifted. Mountain signals bounce. It did not draw one random point. It stored a route. He looked toward the dark ridge above the damaged cabin. "That slope is unstable. We already pulled one crew back because more ground may move." I understood what he was telling me. I also understood what the map was telling us. "Ranger was injured before he retired," I said. "He couldn't cover that distance quickly in this terrain. If he moved uphill that slowly, he wasn't chasing an animal. Sadie was with him, or he was trying to reach her." Grant pushed closer from where a deputy had been keeping him near the command vehicle. "That caller is old," he said. "Mara sees a line on a screen and turns it into whatever story she needs." I did not look at him. "The route leaves the cabin after the water began rising." "You don't know that. The time is recorded. It could be wrong." Grant's voice had changed. He no longer sounded like the calm father organizing a search. He sounded like someone watching the ending of his own story move beyond his control. I followed the line with my finger. It curved toward a narrow service trail and ended near an unlabeled square on the topographic layer. A memory surfaced, not from the custody fight or our marriage, but from a day years earlier when Ranger still wore a search harness. My brother had handled him during a county training exercise at Blackridge Pines. Sadie had been small enough to sit on my shoulders. Volunteers had been given a faded camp map showing the cabins, the old water system, and a concrete pump house above the lower grounds. Ranger had taken that service trail during the exercise. "There's a pump house up there," I said. The search coordinator looked again at his map. "I don't have one marked." It was part of the old camp water system. Concrete building, above the creek. Ranger has been there before. Grant answered before anyone asked him. Sadie wouldn't know how to reach the pump house. Lorna turned toward him. No one said Sadie knew where it was. His mouth opened, then closed. "You said you had not been inside the camp in years," she continued. "You knew about the maintenance cabin, the cot, and now the pump house." "I worked there. Of course I remember buildings." "Then why didn't you mention the pump house when we asked where a child could shelter?" Grant looked toward the ridge. "Because she couldn't get there." The certainty in his voice frightened me more than another denial would have. He had expected Sadie to remain inside the cabin. In his mind, she was still the obedient child he had left behind. The search coordinator raised one hand before Lorna could question him further. "We handle that after we find the child." He traced an alternate line along the ridge. A small team could approach from the upper service road, then move on foot across more stable ground. It was still dangerous, but it avoided the flooded creek and the section where the cabin had been hit. Lorna supported the change. She showed him the stored timestamps and the slow movement pattern, keeping the explanation short. The coordinator sent 4 rescuers uphill, while another group remained at the cabin. Grant protested that they were splitting resources. He said the GPS was unreliable and that anyone alive would have stayed near the building where searchers could find them. I finally looked at him. "Sadie stayed because you told her to." His face went still. I did not need him to answer. Lorna had heard me, and the deputy beside Grant moved closer. The forward staging point shifted to the upper camp road. Lorna drove while I sat beside her with Ranger's route open on my phone. Grant followed in another vehicle with the deputy. No one allowed him to direct the search anymore. The higher road ended at a barrier of fallen branches. From there, rescuers continued on foot. I was allowed to follow as far as a marked safe area near the ridge, where the ground remained firm and the pump house stood somewhere beyond the trees. The rain had weakened slightly, but runoff still poured through every hollow. Machinery growled below as crews worked near the cabin. Radios cracked with overlapping voices. I stared into the trees and imagined Sadie trying to walk with only one shoe. I imagined Ranger's back legs folding beneath him. The map proved they had moved, but it did not prove they had reached shelter. According to Sadie, water had begun seeping beneath the pump house door by then. It did not rush in, as it had at the cabin. It crept through cracks and spread across the lowest part of the concrete floor. Sadie pulled Ranger closer to the raised shelf and kept her hand against his ribs. His breathing had slowed. She rubbed the wet fur along his neck. "You can't sleep yet." Ranger opened his eyes, but did not lift his head. Through the vent, Sadie heard something beneath the rain. At first, she thought it was thunder. Then it came again, lower and steadier. An engine or a piece of rescue equipment was working somewhere downhill. She called for help, but the concrete walls swallowed her voice. A rusted pipe ran along one wall. Sadie found a loose metal bracket near the floor and struck the pipe 3 times. She waited, then struck it 3 more times. No answer came. She hit it again until her hand hurt. Ranger raised his head. A weak sound came from his throat. Sadie touched his muzzle. "Find them." The command was not exact, and Ranger no longer had the strength for a full alert. He gave 3 rough barks, paused to breathe, and tried again. At the edge of the safe area, I heard something beneath the engines. I lifted my hand. "Stop talking." The radio operator looked at me, but Lorna immediately signaled for silence. For several seconds, there was only rain falling from the leaves. Then came a faint metallic tapping. 3 strikes, a pause, and 3 more. One of the rescuers farther up the trail called over the radio. We heard it too. A bark followed, so weak I might have mistaken it for wood breaking, if I had not spent years listening for that exact rhythm. Ranger had been trained to give short, separated alerts when he found a living person. Age had roughened the sound, but it had not erased the pattern. "That's him," I said. "The pump house is in that direction." I pointed uphill, beyond the last visible rescuer. I did not run after them. Every part of me wanted to, but the slope was unstable, and one careless person could delay the people trained to reach Sadie. The team changed direction and disappeared through the trees. Grant shouted that they were following a dog into another dangerous area. The deputy ordered him back. I kept my eyes on the place where the rescuers had vanished. Inside the pump house, Sadie held Ranger's head in her lap, while water spread around her feet. "Again," she whispered. For several seconds, he did not move. Then, from somewhere above us on the ridge, one last hoarse bark broke through the rain. Ranger was alive, and wherever he was, I knew my daughter might still be beside him. The rescue team disappeared above the ridge, following the faint tapping and Ranger's broken bark. I stood behind the safety line with my hands locked together so tightly that my fingernails cut into my palms. The radio remained silent for nearly a minute. It felt longer than every year I had spent with Grant. Then, a rescuer's voice came through. "We found the structure." The old pump house was partly hidden behind fallen branches. Mud had pressed against the lower half of the door, but the concrete walls were still standing. The team could hear something moving inside. I closed my eyes for 1 second. Hearing movement was not the same as hearing Sadie. I could not let hope carry me somewhere the rescuers had not reached yet. Metal struck wood farther up the slope. The team cleared branches and forced an opening around the swollen door. I heard instructions passing over the radio, short and controlled, followed by the scrape of equipment against concrete. Then one of them said, "We have the child." My knees folded before I could stop them. Detective Price caught my elbow and held me upright. "She's conscious," the rescuer continued. "Cold, wet, but responsive. We also have the dog." I covered my mouth, but the sound that escaped me did not feel human. It came from the part of me that had been trapped beside that pink shoe on my kitchen table. The team asked for medical support at the upper staging point. They would bring Sadie down by the safer ridge route, rather than return toward the flooded camp. Lorna kept one hand against my arm. "Let them stabilize her." I nodded, though every nerve in my body was pulling uphill. Grant stood 20 feet away beside a deputy. He had stopped protesting about the GPS route. His face was pale, and his gaze remained fixed on the trees, as if he were still waiting for the moment he had planned. That moment no longer belonged to him. A rescuer appeared first, moving carefully between the wet trunks. Another followed carrying medical equipment. Then I saw a yellow rescue blanket and a small muddy shoe beneath it. "Sadie." I did not shout. I barely managed her name. Her head lifted. The rescuers had wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, but her wet hair clung to her cheeks. Her lips had lost most of their color. The pink shoe on her right foot was brown with mud, while her left foot was bare except for cuts and dirt. She looked at me without moving for half a second, as if she needed to make sure I was real. Then she began to cry. Not the quiet crying she used when she was afraid of upsetting someone. Her whole body shook. The rescuer stopped, and I crossed the final few steps only after he nodded. Sadie reached for me. I held her beneath the blanket and felt how cold she was through every layer of my clothes. "I'm here," I said. "You don't have to do anything else." She pressed her face against my neck. I did not ask what happened. I did not ask where Grant had taken her, or why she had left the cabin. In that moment, questions would have been another demand placed on a child who had already carried too much. A second team emerged behind us with Ranger on a rescue litter. He looked smaller than he had that morning. Mud darkened his fur, and his gray muzzle rested between his front paws. One paw was wrapped in a soaked white sock knotted above the cut. His eyes were open, but he did not lift his head. Sadie twisted in my arms. "Ranger." The rescuers lowered the litter for a moment. I knelt beside him while holding Sadie against me. "Hey, old man," I whispered. Ranger's eyes moved toward my voice. His tail struck the canvas once. Sadie reached beneath the blanket and placed her hand on his neck. He wouldn't let me stay. Her words came between uneven breaths. He kept going to the little door. Then he took me up the hill. She looked at the sock around his paw. But he couldn't climb anymore. I used my backpack. I didn't leave him. I know you didn't. He got me out. You got each other out. Sadie closed her eyes and leaned into me. Ranger had followed Grant because he smelled the child he loved. Sadie had followed Ranger because she finally understood that waiting for her father was more dangerous than disobeying him. Neither of them would have reached that pump house alone. The medical team began moving us toward the ambulance waiting on the upper road. A veterinary emergency vehicle had been called for Ranger. Sadie refused to release his fur until one of the rescuers promised the litter would remain beside her as long as the trail allowed. Grant stepped around the deputy when we reached the staging area. Sadie, her body stiffened against mine. The deputy moved to block him, but Grant raised both hands. "I just need to see that she's safe. I've been looking everywhere." Sadie turned her face toward him. I felt the moment recognition became fear. Grant tried to smile. "It's okay, sweetheart. Daddy found you." Sadie gripped my jacket. "But you knew where I was." The people around us went still. Grant's smile faded. "You're confused. You've been through something frightening. You said you would come back with everyone." "Sadie, this is not the time. I was supposed to run to you." Grant glanced at Detective Price, then at the deputy standing between us. Sadie's voice shook, but she did not stop. "You told me to say I left because Mom scared me." Grant stepped forward. "No, you were supposed to say you left because she made you feel unsafe." His words landed before he understood what he had done. Lorna looked at him. "Supposed to say?" Grant's face changed. "That isn't what I meant. You just corrected her. She is freezing and confused. Mara has been influencing her for years." I pulled Sadie closer. But I did not argue with him. He had finally done what he had spent our entire marriage accusing me of doing. He had spoken too quickly and revealed the truth he was trying to hide. Lorna ordered the deputy to keep Grant away from Sadie and preserve his phone, keys, and vehicle. Grant began demanding an attorney. He said this had been a misunderstanding, that he had never intended for the storm to become dangerous, and that everything he had done was meant to protect his daughter. No one answered him. The paramedics lifted Sadie onto a stretcher. She held my hand while they checked her temperature and wrapped another heated blanket around her. Ranger was placed in the veterinary vehicle beside us, his head still turned toward her voice. I climbed into the ambulance with Sadie. The doors closed before Grant could reach the road. For several minutes, she said nothing. The siren remained off as we moved carefully down the mountain. I sat beside her, holding her cold fingers between both of mine. Sadie watched the rain slide across the rear windows. Then she looked at me. "Is Dad going to disappear because I told?" Sadie's question followed me all the way down the mountain. "Is Dad going to disappear because I told?" I held her hand beneath the heated blanket. The answer she wanted would have been easy and dishonest. I could have promised that nothing would change, that Grant would still call, still visit, and still sit across from her at school events. Children ask questions like that because they are searching for a version of the world in which truth costs nothing. I would not make her carry another lie. "Whatever happens next is because of the choices he made," I said. "Not because you told the truth." She watched my face, waiting for me to soften it. "You didn't make him take you from school. You didn't make him send the box, and you didn't make him leave you in that cabin. Telling what happened does not cause the consequences." Sadie's fingers tightened around mine. "I thought if I did the test wrong, he wouldn't get to see me." "I know. I didn't want him to lose me. You were never supposed to protect him from what he chose to do." At the hospital, doctors treated Sadie for mild hypothermia, dehydration, and cuts along her bare foot. A nurse removed mud from her hair while I sat close enough for Sadie to keep one hand wrapped around my wrist. Ranger had been taken to an emergency veterinary clinic across town. I wanted to be beside him, but Sadie had spent hours believing that both parents had left her. I was not leaving that room until she was ready. A child interview specialist arrived after Sadie had warmed enough to stop shaking. She explained that neither Grant nor I would be in the room, and that Sadie could pause whenever she wanted. No one would ask her to choose a parent or explain what she thought should happen to her father. I waited in the hallway with Detective Price. The interview lasted less than an hour. I did not hear the questions, and I have never filled in the parts Sadie did not later tell me herself. With her permission, Lorna gave me the important facts afterward. Sadie described Diane collecting her from school and taking her to Blackridge Pines. She told them Grant had removed her shoe, taken her phone, and placed her in the cabin. She repeated the sentence he had made her practice and explained that she was supposed to run into his arms when he returned with the search team. She also admitted that she had agreed at first. Grant had told her the judge might stop him from seeing her if she failed. Sadie had believed helping him was the only way to keep both parents in her life. The specialist made sure that part was recorded in Sadie's own words. She had not participated because she understood the plan. She had obeyed because an adult had made her responsible for his place in her life. By morning, Lorna no longer had only a frightened child statement. Ranger's collar connected the route from my house to Grant's SUV, from the SUV to Blackridge Pines, and from the cabin toward the pump house. The data did not explain motive by itself, but it destroyed Grant's claim that the dog had wandered away during an unrelated search. The courier order provided the second link. Confirmation for the scheduled delivery had been found on Grant's phone, placed the night before under an abbreviated version of his name. The pickup instructions described a plain box that matched the one on my kitchen table. Sadie's account supplied the final piece. She knew where the water and blanket had been placed, which door Grant had fastened, and what he expected her to say. Her description matched the cabin. It also matched the correction Grant had blurted out in front of Lorna when he told her what she had been supposed to say. Diane came to the hospital that afternoon. She stopped several feet from me, her face swollen from crying. "I believed him," she said. "He told me a specialist had arranged everything. You saw him waiting at an abandoned camp. He said the woman was late. And you left Sadie there." Diane covered her mouth. "I never thought he would hurt her. I did not comfort her." Grant had built the plan, but Diane had seen enough to ask one more question. She had chosen not to because trusting her son was easier than challenging him. "You did not need to know everything," I said. "You only needed to notice that a 10-year-old was being left in a locked, empty place." She asked whether she could see Sadie. I told her that decision would not belong to either of us until Sadie and her therapist were ready. Grant's lawyer released a statement that evening, calling the event a misunderstood custody exercise that had been overtaken by unexpected weather. Grant claimed he had never intended to endanger Sadie and that he had planned to retrieve her within an hour. The explanation only made his later choice worse. His phone had received the flash flood warning. He had heard rescuers say the access road was underwater. He had known exactly where the cabin stood and still refused to name it. Whatever he had intended at the beginning no longer excused what he chose after the storm turned dangerous. The emergency custody hearing was brief. The judge issued a temporary order barring Grant from unsupervised contact with Sadie, while the criminal investigation and child safety evaluation continued. There was no dramatic speech and no instant prison sentence. There was only a written order establishing that Grant could no longer place himself alone between Sadie and everyone trying to protect her. My attorney asked me to send every message Grant and I had exchanged about custody. For years, I had imagined that being believed required me to present the cleanest version of myself. I considered deleting the messages in which I apologized after Grant insulted me, or the ones where I questioned whether I was overreacting. Instead, I sent everything. Those messages showed how often I had doubted myself, and how carefully Grant had encouraged that doubt. I was no longer assembling an image of the perfect mother. I was preserving the truth, including the parts where I had been afraid. Sadie was discharged the next afternoon. Our first stop was the veterinary clinic. Ranger lay on a padded mat, with his injured paw bandaged and a support wrap around his shoulder. The veterinarian said exhaustion had worsened the old injury. He would need weeks of rest, and he might never manage another long climb. Sadie sat beside him without touching the bandages. Ranger opened his eyes, lifted his head a few inches, and settled it across her knee. She placed one hand between his ears. "I didn't leave him," she said. I understood that she was not speaking only about Ranger. When Sadie said she had not left Ranger, I understood that she was not speaking only about the dog lying across her knees. Some part of her still believed she had abandoned Grant by telling the truth. For weeks, she watched the front window whenever a car slowed outside. She never asked when he was coming home, because he had not lived with us for years, but fear does not always care about addresses. She was waiting to learn whether honesty had erased her father. The court did not give her an easy answer. Grant's request for primary custody collapsed as soon as the emergency order was reviewed. His contact with Sadie remained suspended, while the child safety evaluation continued. The criminal investigation examined the false kidnapping report, the courier package, the evidence he had manufactured, and his decision to conceal Sadie's location after receiving the flash flood warning. No one promised us a particular charge or sentence. Those decisions belonged to investigators, prosecutors, and courts that would move more slowly than our fear had moved that afternoon. The part that mattered immediately was simple. Grant could no longer reach Sadie without supervision, preparation, and the approval of people whose first responsibility was her safety. He sent messages through his attorney claiming he wanted to explain. He said the storm had changed a controlled plan into an accident. He insisted he had only wanted the judge to understand how unstable our shared arrangement had become. I did not answer him directly. All communication went through the court-approved parenting application and our attorneys. I stopped writing long paragraphs defending every decision. I gave the necessary information, recorded what needed to be recorded, and refused to debate whether protecting Sadie made me hostile. My attorney once asked whether I worried Grant would call that behavior uncooperative. "He can call it whatever helps him sleep," I said. "Protecting Sadie is not an act of aggression." The words surprised me after I spoke them. During our marriage, I had measured every sentence by how Grant might repeat it later. Now I measured decisions by what they did to the child standing in the middle. Diane was removed from the school pickup list before Sadie returned to class. She was not allowed to collect Sadie, transport her, or spend time alone with her. A letter arrived from her 2 weeks after the rescue. She apologized for trusting Grant and wrote that she had believed a father could not intentionally place his own daughter in danger. She said she had replayed the moment she left Blackridge Pines every night. I placed the sealed envelope in a drawer. Sadie knew it existed. I told her she could read it someday, ask me to throw it away, or leave it untouched. I would not make forgiveness another duty adults placed on her. She chose to leave the letter where it was. Returning to school took longer than leaving the hospital. Sadie could walk again within days, but the sound of an emergency alert froze her wherever she stood. Heavy rain sent her toward the nearest window to check whether water was rising. At night, she sometimes woke convinced she was back inside the cabin, waiting for Grant to return with people who expected her to lie. Her therapist never asked her to decide whether she loved him. She helped Sadie separate love from obedience and fear from responsibility. Sadie no longer carried messages between adults. When Grant's attorney requested a supervised visit, the decision was discussed by professionals without asking her to make it easier for everyone else. When Sadie said she was not ready, no one corrected her or called her cruel. The first time she returned to class, I walked her to the entrance. Ranger could not come because he was still recovering, so Sadie carried the tag from his old search harness in her pocket. At the door, she looked at the clouds gathering above the mountains. "I'm okay," she said automatically. Then she stopped. "No, I'm not. I'm scared. I felt the old impulse to reassure her that nothing bad would happen. I resisted it because promises about the future had already been used to control her. You can be scared and still go inside, I said. You can also ask me to stay for another minute. She asked for the minute. When it ended, she walked through the doors on her own. Ranger's recovery moved more slowly. The veterinarian fitted him with a support harness that allowed us to steady his back legs on the porch steps. His injured paw healed, but the climb to the pump house had permanently worsened his shoulder. He would never work another search. He would never again travel 200 yards through mud carrying the responsibility for someone else's life. He did not need to. We moved his padded bed beneath the front window, so he could continue watching for Sadie's bus. On good afternoons, he stood before it turned onto our street. On difficult days, he remained lying down and lifted only his head. Sadie never seemed disappointed. She placed his medicine in his food every morning and sat beside him until he finished. When he needed help climbing the porch, she held one side of the support harness while I held the other. Grant had believed an old dog mattered only if he could still perform. Sadie understood that Ranger had been family long before he followed that SUV. The police returned her pink shoe after it was no longer needed as evidence. I set it beside its muddy match on the kitchen table. The silver star near the heel had begun peeling from the canvas. You don't have to keep them, I told Sadie. You also don't have to throw them away. She stared at the pair for a long time. Then she carried them to her room. The next morning, both shoes were in the trash. The silver star was not. Sadie had carefully removed it and pressed it onto the cover of a new adventure book. The edges were rough, and a thin line of pink fabric remained beneath the silver. Grant had used the shoe to prove he controlled where Sadie was, and what I believed. She had taken back the only part she wanted. By early winter, the mountain roads had reopened. Blackridge Pines remained closed, and the maintenance cabin was marked for demolition. I never returned to the pump house. Sadie did not need to see it again to prove she had survived it. One evening, rain began tapping against the windows. Sadie glanced up but did not leave the room. She sat on the floor beside Ranger's bed, the new book open across her knees. Ranger rested with his head near her ankle, his breathing deep and slow. She read until her voice began to tire. You can stop, I said from the couch. You don't have to finish tonight. Sadie ran one finger over the silver star on the cover. I know. I just want him to hear the ending. She read another page, then closed the book without reaching the final chapter. For a while, the three of us listened to the rain. I'm still scared sometimes, she said. I moved from the couch and sat beside her on the floor. You don't have to be okay for me. Sadie leaned against my shoulder. Ranger released a long breath and settled his head across her legs. He stayed awake long enough to hear the ending. For the first time in years, neither Sadie nor I had to pretend it was a happy one before we were ready.